Hello and welcome to Starbound's second channel. My name is Gabriel the Bibi Capaldi and I'll be your narrator today. But before we get into today's story, please do check down below that you are subscribed to the channel. It's 100% free and helps us pop up on your feed a bit more often. Ludar stared at the horizon as another Lumahiri defense line collapsed under the Khamori assault. 6 months of brutal war had taught him to recognize defeat, and this was its unmistakable face. Methodical, relentless, and inevitable. Their people were fighting valiantly, but valor alone couldn't overcome the overwhelming numbers. The thought that had been growing in his mind for weeks finally crystallized into certainty. Conventional warfare would not save them. "How many casualties?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would be too many. The neural implant nestled against his skull buzzed with incoming data. A technology originally designed for academic and scientific collaboration, now repurposed for war communications. Every few seconds, new casualty reports, tactical assessments, and strategic recommendations flooded directly into his consciousness, a relentless stream of increasingly dire information. 1,700 in Sector 4 alone, replied General Khamori, his voice heavy with the weight of command. But they lost over 5,000! The command center of the Lumahiri forces hovered miles above the actual front lines, a perfect example of their engineering brilliance even in despair. The floating platform was a construction of translucent alloys and gravity manipulation, allowing those inside to witness the decimation of their world through reinforced viewports and countless screens. Tactical displays bathed the room in a cold blue glow, highlighting the sharp angles of Lumahiri faces as they tracked the relentless advance of the Khamori forces. Ludar stood motionless before the central display, his tall, slender frame rigid with tension. Like all Lumahiri, his most striking feature was the network of luminescent veins tracing patterns along his neck, evolutionary remnants from ancestors who used bioluminescence to navigate the darkened caverns of their ancient past. These veins no longer projected emotion as they had millennia ago, but they remained a distinctive mark of their species. His large, wide-set eyes reflected the scrolling data of another failed defense, pupils contracting to thin lines against the ambient light. Through the transparent floor sections of the command platform, they could see their homeworld below, once celebrated for its floating cities and gardens, now scarred and burning. This was not a conflict over resources or territory. It had begun with a first contact situation that went catastrophically wrong. The Lumahiri had no hostile intentions, but cultural misunderstandings led to immediate aggression from the previously unknown species. The Khamori ships moved with unsettling silence through the atmosphere, appearing almost ghost-like as they glided between the once majestic floating cities without the expected sounds of propulsion. What was particularly concerning was that while they had destroyed much of the Lumahiri aerial defenses, they hadn't bombarded the planet into submission despite clearly having the capability. Their approach suggested they wanted to preserve the world, just not its inhabitants, likely for examination and study after the Lumahiri were gone. Ludar had seen the Khamori up close only in captured footage. They were furred bipedals, significantly larger than the Lumahiri, with natural exoskeletal features projecting vital areas and enhanced muscular structures that gave them superior strength. Where the Lumahiri were built for precision and intellect, the Khamori were designed by evolution for dominance and conquest. "They don't care about casualties," Khamori said, watching as the displays updated to show yet another Khamori assault wave forming. "They simply overwhelm with numbers what they can't win with strategy." Ludar pointed to a different section of the display, where casualty statistics scrolled past. "Look at their losses. For every 10 of our soldiers, they lose 30 of theirs. We're hurting them." "Not enough," Khamori replied, his shoulders slumping. "They have numbers we do not." The neural implants in both their heads alerted them simultaneously. More bad news. Yet another front line had collapsed. Though at significant cost to the invading forces, The pattern was becoming clear. The Lumahiri could cause tremendous damage to the Khamori forces, but victory remained impossible. Each engagement ended the same way, with Lumahiri defeat despite the heavy toll they extracted. Their conversation was interrupted with a communication request flashed on the main display. The face that appeared belonged to Hassari, the Khamori general, his exoskeletal features arranged in what might be their version of a diplomatic expression.
Lumahiri leadership,
Hassari began, his translated voice unnaturally smooth.
You continue to resist what is inevitable.
Komar stepped forward, keeping his posture straight despite his exhaustion.
We will defend our world to the last, Lumahiri. Your forces have suffered heavy losses. Is this slaughter really necessary?
Your species represents a potential threat,
Hassari replied, his artificial tone conveying no emotion.
Your continued existence cannot be permitted.
We never threatened you,
Komar responded, his eyes narrowing with indignation.
First contact was peaceful until your forces opened fire.
Your delegation disrespected sacred protocols and mocked our religion,
Hassari countered.
While this is regrettable, we cannot allow a potential hostile species to remain now that things have escalated this far. This is not personal, merely preventative.
As Hassari continued to speak, his words became increasingly condescending. He repeated many times with different words that this was nothing personal, and that his species couldn't afford the chance that the Lumahiri would one day come to their homeworld and do the same that they had done here. Though exactly what offense the Lumahiri had committed remained deliberately vague.
We offer terms,
Hassari said finally.
Surrender your military capabilities, submit to Khamori authority, and your species will be preserved under study protocols. You have 6 hours to respond.
The communication ended abruptly, leaving the command center in silence. After a long moment, Komar's posture slumped further.
We should consider the terms. Our people might survive as specimens, at least.
Around them, the other Lumahiri officers stared at their general in shock, though few could argue with his assessment. The statistics were unmistakable. Total defeat was merely a matter of time. Yet, Ludar refused to accept this outcome. His mind raced through possibilities, analyzing and discarding options at a furious pace. There must be something they hadn't tried, some approach that could change the seemingly inevitable outcome. While Komar seemed ready to capitulate, Ludar kept searching for a solution to what appeared unsolvable.
There's one option we haven't tried,
Ludar finally said, breaking the heavy silence.
The Galactic Mercenary Network. Mercenaries?
Komar scoffed, giving Ludar an incredulous look.
We barely have enough war funds to feed our troops for another month. Then we don't hire many,
Ludar responded, his voice taking on a desperate edge.
We hire one, the most expensive one.
He brought up a profile on his personal display, swiping it to the main screen for all to see. The price listed caused Komar's eyes to widen in shock.
That's absurd. One mercenary against an invasion force?
Komar gestured to the battle statistics still scrolling beside the profile.
It would take an army of mercenaries to make any difference. This isn't just a mercenary,
Ludar insisted, enlarging the image accompanying the profile.
This is a human.
The words sent murmurs through the command center. Humans were rare in this sector of the galaxy, and their reputation was the stuff of exaggerated tales. Warriors from a high-gravity world with technology that seemed to blur the lines between machinery and biology. Most Lumahiri considered such stories to be embellished myths. Cautionary tales about a dangerous species, thankfully contained to their own distant sector. But Ludar had studied xenoanthropology before becoming a military officer. He knew the stories had kernels of truth. Humans had evolved in a world that forced adaptation to countless threats, and their technological development had been shaped by millennia of warfare against themselves before they ever reached the stars.
A human?
Komar repeated, staring at the profile, then at the battle statistics. His expression shifted from dismissal to desperate consideration.
What could one human possibly do that our entire defense force cannot? The rumors about them, if even half of them are true, it would be worth the risk,
Ludar said, his voice gaining confidence.
Their natural collections allow for combat interfaces that would kill most species. Their bodies can be enhanced, modified, pushed beyond biological limits, and they specialize in asymmetric warfare, situations precisely like ours.
The command center fell silent again as everyone contemplated this last, desperate option. On the displays around them, the Khamori forces continued their dismantling of Lumahiri civilization. After a long moment, Koma sighed deeply.
The price? Is everything we have left,
Ludar finished for him.
But what good is saving our war funds if there's no one left to spend them on?
Koma studied the human's profile once more. They looked at the burning cities below.
Do whatever you want, advisor. I've run out of ideas.
Ludar didn't waste a moment. His fingers moved across his console, authorizing the transfer of the last reserves of the Lumahiri war chest. The system asked for final confirmation. The amount was unprecedented for a single contract. He hesitated only for a heartbeat before pressing confirm. Somewhere across the galaxy, a human mercenary received the contract, reviewed the impossible odds, and accepted without negotiation. The record-breaking payment was transferred, and a single drop pod was prepared for atmospheric insertion. 3 days later, as Ludar stared at the tactical display showing the Khamori's final push towards the last Lumahiri stronghold, his neural implant showed him a different kind of alert. A small object had entered the outer atmosphere, too small for a warship, too controlled for debris.
What is it?
Koma asked, noticing Ludar's sudden attention shift.
Our last hope,
Ludar replied, watching as the tiny blip descended towards the heart of the Khamori command structure.
A single drop pod with one human inside.
Koma looked skeptical, but as they both watched the pod's trajectory, impossibly accurate, evading automated defense systems with ease, his expression slowly changed to one of disbelief, then to the first glimmer of hope he'd shown in weeks. The observation deck had been hastily converted into a war room specifically to track the incoming mercenary. Advanced tracking systems, calibrated to their highest sensitivity, followed the human's drop pod as it carved a blazing path through the atmosphere. Senior military staff crowded around the displays, their expressions tense with a mixture of hope and skepticism, the veins in their necks glowing steadily with heightened alertness.
Entering upper atmosphere now,
announced a technician. As all eyes fixed on the main display, the small dot representing the drop pod blinked as the tracking algorithms updated its position. Ludar stood rigid beside General Koma, both watching with intensity as the pod's trajectory data scrolled alongside the main visual. A storm system that had developed over the battlefield, whether natural or from the consequences of war was unclear, created turbulent atmospheric conditions. Missile flashes from Khamori defense systems illuminated the clouds, creating an appropriately dramatic backdrop for what was about to unfold.
You're sure this human understands the mission parameters?
Koma asked, his voice tight with doubt.
The contract was clear,
Ludar responded, trying to project more confidence than he felt.
Complete disruption of the Khamori command structure, with extra compensation for each high-ranking officer eliminated.
On the screens, they could see that the battlefield below had changed dramatically in recent days. The Khamori had pushed further inland, establishing a primary command post in what was once the Lumahiri capital's central plaza. 5 Khamori generals, including Hassari, now directed different aspects of the invasion from this location. Their forces had formed a perimeter around this command post, with heavy artillery and air defense systems established in concentric rings, a fortress within a conquered city. The pod continued its streaking descent, leaving a fiery tail that bisected the darkening sky. What initially appeared to be a standard entry pattern suddenly changed.
It's altering course.
The same technician called out, confusion evident in his voice.
The trajectory is... No, that can't be.
Ludar leaned forward, studying the readings. On the main display, they watched as the pod began performing a series of maneuvers that should have been deadly for a living being entering the atmosphere at such velocity. The Khamori anti-aircraft batteries tracked and fired, but the pod moved with uncanny speed, threading between energy blasts that would have vaporized anything else.
That's impossible,
Komar whispered, his eyes widening.
No drop pod has that kind of maneuverability. The living being inside should break apart under those G-forces. Humans,
Ludar said.
Hopefully the legends were true.
The pod's trajectory became increasingly focused, and with mounting disbelief, everyone on the observation deck watched as it aimed directly for the Khamori central command post. Defense systems fired frantically, filling the sky with energy bursts and missile contrails, but the pod weaved between them with precision that seemed almost persistent.
It can't be.
Kormar gasped as the pod's final destination became clear.
It's aiming for...
The impact was visible even from their altitude, a flash of light followed by a shockwave that rippled through the Khamori defense rings. The pod had crashed with pinpoint accuracy, directly onto the central command structure. The surveillance feed zoomed in automatically, showing Khamori soldiers scrambling in confusion as the smoking pod had crushed several of their number beneath it, including, Ludar realized with a jolt of vindication, General Hassery himself. A stunned silence fell over the observation deck as they watched the live feed of the pod's door opening, atmospheric pressure equalizing in a cloud of steam. A figure emerged, tall by Lumahiri standards but average for a human, clad in armor that seemed to shift colors to match the surroundings. The human paused for only a fraction of a second, assessing the chaos, before drawing a sidearm with fluid precision. 2 nearby Khamori officers fell before they could even raise their weapons.
3 high-ranking officers eliminated in first 30 seconds,
Ludar noted, the veins in his neck glowing brighter with vindication. This was exactly what he had hoped for, what he had spent their last war funds on. On the screens from their spying squads, they watched as the remaining Khamori generals frantically ordered their forces to converge on the human. Hundreds of soldiers began to close in, forming a tightening circle around the impact site.
They'll overwhelm him,
Komar said, his voice dropping as hope faded once more. But the human, this mercenary they had staked everything on, showed no signs of concern. As the first wave of Khamori soldiers rushed forward, the human's movements became a blur of lethal force. The sidearm fired in precise 3-round bursts, each cluster finding vulnerable points in Khamori exoskeletons. When the closest attackers closed to melee range, the human shifted tactics without hesitation, the gun disappearing into a holster as combat blades extended from forearm sheaths. The fight that followed left the Lumahiri observers speechless. The human moved through the Khamori soldiers like water flowing around stones, always in motion, never where the enemy expected. Each movement flowed seamlessly into the next, every strike targeting joints, sensory organs, or the narrow gaps in natural armor that only someone with intimate knowledge of Khamori physiology would know how to exploit.
How?
One of the senior officers whispered.
How can he do that?
When a Khamori heavy weapons team set up at the edge of the plaza, the human didn't retreat. Instead, a small object was pulled from a compartment and thrown with perfect aim. The resulting explosion wasn't large, but it was enough to hurt the living.
He is,
Ludar noted,
smashing them like insects.
As the battle intensified, a Khamori combat vehicle rolled into the plaza, its main cannon swiveling to target the human. This seemed finally to be an overwhelming threat. No single combatant could withstand such firepower. The human sprinted directly toward the vehicle instead of away from it. Before the cannon could fire, the mercenary had leapt onto its hull, attached something to its armor plating, and vaulted away. Seconds later, the vehicle's systems failed visibly, its lights flickering out as its engine died.
An EMP charge.
Komar said, his tactical experience recognizing the technology.
Disabled rather than destroyed.
A direct communications channel activated, and the human's voice came through for the first time, calm and measured despite being in the midst of combat. Primary target eliminated. Moving to secondary objectives. 4 command-level targets remaining. I hope you can all afford the bonuses you promised me. The voice had an unsettling quality. Not mechanical exactly, but altered, enhanced. It carried undertones that suggested vocal modifications designed to optimize communication clarity under combat conditions. This wasn't just a mercenary. This was a living weapon system.
Acknowledged,
Ludar responded, unable to keep a note of awe from his voice.
Be advised, Khamori reinforcements approaching from Western Quadrant.
Noted. The single-word response carried confidence that bordered on indifference. On the screens, they watched as the human methodically worked through the Khamori forces, moving toward the location where intelligence suggested the second general had retreated. The fighting style continued to evolve, adapting to each new threat with seemingly limitless tactical options. The remaining Khamori forces, recognizing the unprecedented threat, began to coordinate more effectively. 3 heavy attack groups converged simultaneously, while snipers took positions on surrounding structures. This was no longer a chaotic response, but a deliberate attempt to trap and eliminate the human through overwhelming firepower.
They've adapted their tactics,
Kormar observed, concern evident in his voice.
They're treating a single combatant as a strategic level threat. As they should,
Ludar replied, watching as the human assessed the new situation. For the first time, the mercenary seemed to recognize the changing odds. The human touched something on his armor, a control panel integrated into the forearm section, and a visible change rippled across the entire suit. The effect was immediate and stunning. The human's movements, already impressive, became a blur, faster than the surveillance team could properly track. The Khamori soldiers, firing at where the human had been a fraction of a second before, found themselves attacking empty air as the mercenary moved through their formations with impossible speed. Cybernetic enhancements activated. The human's voice came through the communication channel, with something almost like satisfaction underlying the words. Now, it's a fair fight. What followed was unlike anything the Lumahiri had witnessed in 6 months of brutal warfare. The human moved through the Khamori fences with a combination of speed, accuracy, and lethality that defied conventional combat physics. Each movement served multiple purposes: a dodge that positioned itself for a counterattack, a strike that used an enemy's momentum against them, a trajectory that kept multiple opponents in disadvantageous positions.
This is what the contract paid for,
Ludar said quietly, as they watched the human dismantle what had been an overwhelming force.
This is why one human is worth more than some armies.
The second Khamori general attempted to escape in a transport vessel, lifting off from a makeshift landing pad behind the command post. The human noticed immediately, drew what appeared to be a compact launcher from a back-mounted holster, and fired a single projectile. The transport's engines flared briefly before the entire craft lost power, settling back to the ground with a heavy impact. The human was moving toward it before it had fully settled, dispatching the protective detail methodically before reaching the general. Unlike the chaotic death of Hasari, this elimination was executed with chilling coldness, a single shot that penetrated the Khamori's natural armor at its thinnest point. Secondary target eliminated, the human reported, moving to the next objective. The battlefield had transformed from an organized Khamori occupation into a spreading zone of chaos. The invaders, confronted with a threat outside their experience, began to abandon ordered formations in favor of more defensive postures. Signal chatter, intercepted and translated by Lumahiri intelligence, indicated growing fear among the Khamori forces. The word they used to describe the human was translated roughly as demon.
They're afraid,
Komar said. disbelief and hope mingling in his voice.
One human has them afraid.
Ludar watched as the mercenary continued the systematic campaign against the Khamori command structure. This was more than he had hoped for. Not just a disruption, but a complete reversal of the invasion's momentum. As night fell fully over the battlefield, the human activated another system in the combat armor, a field that bent light around the suit, rendering the mercenary nearly invisible against the darkness. The Khamori, lacking the advanced visual enhancements that might counter such technology, found themselves hunting shadows.
We should deploy ground forces to support,
Kormar suggested, military instincts recognizing the opportunity. Ludar considered this briefly before shaking his head.
No, we'd only get in the way. This isn't our kind of warfare anymore.
On the screens, they watched as the human disappeared into the night, moving toward the last known position of the third Khamori general. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since the invasion began, Ludar allowed himself to feel something beyond desperate calculation. He felt hope. As night deepened, the human continued his methodical advance through enemy territory. The Khamori, initially confident in their overwhelming numbers, now moved with hesitation, constantly looking over their shoulders. Word had spread quickly through their ranks about the devastating efficiency of this single combatant. Dawn broke over a transformed battlefield. Ludar hadn't left the command center all night, transfixed by the unfolding destruction of what had seemed an unbeatable enemy. What had been an organized Khamori occupation was now a fragmented chaos of isolated units, desperately trying to re-establish the chain of command.
Third quadrant is showing heavy Khamori reinforcements,
Ludar communicated to the human mercenary, who they now knew was called Merrick.
They're attempting to flank your position.
Understood, came the terse reply. On the surveillance feed, they watched as Merrick scaled a half-collapsed building with great speed, using one arm that suddenly extended like a grappling hook. The massive sniper rifle on his back hadn't showed him in the slightest. The urban environment, already damaged from previous fighting, had become a three-dimensional chessboard for the human mercenary. Merrick moved through the ruins with an intuitive understanding of sightlines, cover, and tactical advantage that made it clear this was far from his first urban combat zone. Reaching a vantage point, Merrick unslung the rifle, a weapon almost as long as he was tall. Within seconds, he began eliminating Khamori squad leaders across the battlefield. Each shot found its mark despite the darkness. The Khamori formations, already disoriented from the loss of their generals, now collapsed into disarray as their field leadership vanished in an orchestrated sequence. The remaining Khamori generals had separated to different command positions, abandoning their central headquarters after witnessing the fate of their colleagues. They now directed their forces from mobile command units, constantly on the move to avoid being targeted. It was a desperate strategy, and, from the Lumahiri command platform, Ludar could see it was already failing. When a Khamori aircraft approached Merrick's position, the human didn't retreat. Instead, he reached into a compartment of his armor and released what appeared to be a handful of sand. The sand spread out, revealing itself to be hundreds of tiny drone insects that swarmed towards the aircraft, infiltrating its engines and detonating in coordinated sequence. The aircraft spiraled down, crashing into a Khamori artillery position. Drone swarm depleted, Merrick reported casually, moving to position Bravo. The Lumahiri command center watched in astonishment as one human kept moving. The fourth Khamori general committed a fatal error, attempting to coordinate a counterattack from what he believed was a secure position. Merrick infiltrated the mobile command unit with such stealth that the first indication of his presence was the general's sudden collapse. The nearly microscopic dart in his neck visible only when the surveillance feed zoomed in to maximum magnification. The fifth and final general, watching his entire command structure crumble around him, adopted a desperate strategy, ordering all remaining forces to converge on Merrick's last known position. Thousands of Khamori soldiers formed a tightening circle, certain that no single combatant could withstand such numbers.
They're concentrating everything they have left.
Khamori observed, his voice tense.
Even a human can't fight thousands at once.
Ludar studied the tactical display, noting how the Khamori forces had left other positions vulnerable in their desperation to eliminate the human.
Perhaps that's exactly what he wanted.
On the surveillance feed, they watched as Merrick calmly assessed the approaching forces. Instead of seeking escape, he moved to the center of a ruined courtyard, seemingly inviting the attack. As the Khamori closed in, weapons charged and ready. Merrick activated his most devastating tool yet, a localized EMP that expanded in a perfect sphere around him. Energy weapons flickered and died in a half-mile radius, leaving the Khamori with only physical weapons.
Electronic warfare capabilities,
Ludar noted with appreciation.
He's leveling the playing field.
As the confused soldiers looked at their malfunctioning equipment, Merrick emerged in their midst, now wielding blades that extended from his forearms. The ensuing combat was so swift and efficient that many Khamori didn't even realize that they had been defeated until they fell. The human moved through their ranks like a force of nature, unstoppable, inevitable. The final general, watching this unfold from what he believed was a secure bunker, found Merrick suddenly standing before him, blood-slicked blades still extended from his armor. The surveillance feed couldn't capture what words were exchanged, but the outcome was clear. The general activated an emergency communication channel to the Khamori fleet in orbit.
Cease all hostilities,
The general's translated voice echoed through the Lumahiri command center.
We will withdraw from this planet.
The Lumahiri officers stood in stunned silence, unable to process what they were hearing. After 6 months of relentless warfare, after watching their cities fall and their people die, victory had come in the form of a single human, with a set of specialized skills and tools.
They're retreating,
Khamori said, his voice barely above a whisper.
One human turned the tide of an entire war.
Ludar watched as Khamori forces began to disengage across the battlefield, pulling back toward their landing craft.
Not just any human, he corrected. The most expensive mercenary in the galaxy.
The storm that had hung over the battlefield began to clear, sunlight breaking through for the first time in days. Below, the human mercenary emerged from the bunker, helmet still in place, moving with the same confidence he had shown since arriving. The mission was complete. 4 generals eliminated, an invasion force thrown into disarray, and terms of surrender secured. Contract fulfilled, Merrick's voice came through the communication channel. As the message ended, Ludar realized he had been holding his breath. He exchanged a look with Khamori, one filled with disbelief, relief, and the dawning understanding that their civilization would survive.
Prepare for the negotiation phase,
Ludar instructed, already thinking ahead to what would come next. The war wasn't formally over yet. There would be terms to discuss, agreements to secure. But as he watched the human mercenary calmly walking through a battlefield littered with the remnants of what had been an overwhelming invasion force, Ludar knew with absolute certainty that the Lumahiri would be negotiating from a position of strength. The negotiations took place in a neutral location, a former Lumahiri cultural center that had remained relatively intact during the invasion. The Grand Hall, with its vaulted ceilings and ceremonial architecture, now served as the backdrop for the conclusion of a war that had nearly ended the Lumahiri civilization. The surviving 5th Khamori general and his remaining sub-commander sat across from General Khamori and advisor Ludar. Between them stood Merrick, his armor now clean of battle damage but still imposing. The human's helmet remained on, the featureless visor reflecting the Khamori general's own image back at him. A psychological tactic not lost on Ludar. The general couldn't help but shift nervously, having witnessed firsthand what the human was capable of. Outside, Lumahiri citizens had begun to emerge from shelters, cautiously reclaiming their cities. Khamori forces had withdrawn to their ships, maintaining orbit but no longer engaged in hostilities. The storm had cleared completely, and sunlight streamed through the cultural center's crystal windows, creating prismatic patterns across the negotiation table.
These terms are unacceptable,
The final Khamori general growled, pushing away the datapad with the proposed surrender agreement, though with noticeably less conviction than his posturing suggested. Merrick, who had been standing silently behind the Lumahiri delegation, took one step forward. The simple movement caused the Khamori general to flinch visibly, the memory of being confronted in his bunker still fresh. "Perhaps I should clarify something," Merrick said, his voice modulated through his helmet speakers. "I'm not part of these negotiations. I'm simply insurance."
What does that mean?
The sub-commander asked, looking nervously at his superior.
It means
Ludar interjected, gaining confidence from Merrick's presence.
that while you were focused on our planet, you failed to notice that we've been in contact with the human mercenary network. Merrick has colleagues, many of them, who are currently awaiting coordinates.
This was a bluff, but one delivered with perfect conviction. The Khamori generals and his subordinate exchanged glances.
One human has decimated your invasion force,
Korma added.
Imagine what a dozen could do to your home world.
Merrick casually tapped a control on his wrist display. A holographic projection appeared, showing what appeared to be targeting data for the Khamori home system. Another bluff, but the meticulously prepared details, secretly produced by Lumahiri intelligence overnight, made it convincing.
We did not come here planning for total war,
the Khamori general said, his posture slumping slightly. His forced bravado was rapidly fading.
No one wants a total war,
Ludar responded.
Yet here we are. The terms are simple. Complete withdrawal from our system, formal recognition of Lumahiri sovereignty, and reparations for damage caused.
And if we refuse?
The sub-commander challenged, though his tone betrayed he already knew the answer. Merrick answered by removing a small device from his armor and placing it on the table. It projected the images of 11 other humans, each with specialized combat armor similar to Merrick's. "My team is assembled," Merrick stated. "They await my signal. Decision time." The Khamori general pulled the datapad back and reviewed the terms again, his gaze occasionally flicking up to Merrick's impassive visor.
We will withdraw. We will recognize your sovereignty. The reparations, however,
are non-negotiable,
Ludar interrupted.
Consider them the price of education. You've learned an expensive lesson about attacking planets for stupid reasons.
Hours later, the treaty was signed. As the Khamori delegation departed, Ludar approached Merrick, who was preparing his own ship for departure.
Your fee has been transferred as agreed, with the bonuses for the eliminated generals,
Ludar said.
The Lumahiri owe you a debt beyond currency.
Merrick removed his helmet for the first time, revealing surprisingly ordinary human features. "Just business," he replied. But there was a hint of something more in his expression.
Was it true?
Ludar asked.
About your team being ready to deploy?
Merrick smiled slightly. Would it matter? The threat worked.
And if it hadn't?
The human's expression turned serious. Then I would have finished what I started. That is, if you could afford it. As Merrick's ship lifted off, Ludar rejoined Korma at the command platform, watching the Khamori fleet break orbit.
Do you think they'll honor the agreement?
Korma asked, his expression still cautious. Ludar considered this as they watched Merrick's small ship accelerate away from their world.
I think the galaxy will soon hear stories about what happened when the Khamori encountered the Lumahiri, and their human ally. Some lessons only need to be taught once.
The floating platform's viewports showed their world below, damaged but intact, ready to rebuild. And somewhere in orbit, the last Khamori ship from the invasion force carried word back to the Khamori homeworld. A single human mercenary had accomplished what their military analyst had deemed impossible. Perhaps this war would become just another myth that other species wouldn't believe. but one the Khamori would never forget.